there are aspects of that framework that, I mean, yes, you probably think about them at some point, but they're only relevant in that moment. So I think it's good to have that framework to kind of reference and to think about, because I know for me there are aspects of that framework that I wouldn't, I mean, when you think about them, yes, they are incredibly relevant, but it's something that falls by the wayside for my own practice, I think. There are some aspects of it that may not be as relevant to me. It's interesting that looking through that, it really kind of helped me recognize some of the things I do need to develop in myself. Things like organizational skills, time management, it's kind of this old student standbys, right? Financial issues, those sorts of skills are definitely weaker on my spectrum. So that definitely brought them to light and reminded me of them for good or ill.
I think a framework that helps people begin to think about what a professional researcher actually is a useful thing. We know what a writer is. We know what a novelist is. But the notion of a professional researcher is still a new one. So I think that any guidance, any framework, any sort of methodology toward that is a really welcome and useful thing.
I think it's very useful, actually. There are areas in the wheel of the RDF framework that I haven't really thought about at all. Some are kind of obvious. The personal effectiveness is something that I would have anticipated, but certainly not some of the other areas. I've used the framework and referred to it probably because in my first year I was so getting to grips with my own research that I wasn't really looking beyond that. But I think from now on I'll be using it a lot more, actually.
I think the usefulness of this is the way that it identifies these very broad areas, which of course in practice are not separate from each other. They're integrated with each other. They're different aspects of the same creative life. It identifies them and then it breaks them up into smaller categories, which I think are lined along the outer ring of the diagram. And that, I think, does help someone, or could help someone, identify those areas that they're not really thinking about, those areas that they've neglected and need to work on.
I think it's useful for my academic career, my future, and what I do after I've done my PhD. And it is useful to me at the moment in terms of thinking in those things and thinking what skills I need to acquire for future teaching. But I don't think it has any bearing on the actual completion of my PhD, but that's purely because it's practice led. I think it would have much more relevance were I doing a philosophy PhD or something.
I think with any framework like that, you have to make it fit, particularly if it's a generic thing, you have to make it fit the discipline that you're working in. And with creative writing, obviously there are certain skills that we've talked about in terms of structure and character development, conflict, all of those things that people wouldn't necessarily know. So there's certainly knowledge that people need to know technically about how to do different things depending on what it is that they're trying to write. But it's also about saying, well, how do we make what we do fit that framework? Does what we do fit that framework? If it does, let's be explicit about it and say how it fits. And if it doesn't, if there's obviously a gap, then we need to think about why there's a gap and whether that particular aspect of it is appropriate to creative writing.
It's massively complicated. I think it's the sheer scale of it, in that it's very off-putting. To me, it's like I don't pick up books like Lord of the Rings because it's massive and heavy.
Quite useful because it encourages you to think about a kind of holistic approach to the research. So I think novelists are quite single-minded about the fact that I'm writing a novel, and actually there's stuff on there about work-life balance which you wouldn't necessarily bring into the concept of the research as a whole. Yeah, so, and it's reminding you about things like public engagement and your responsibilities as a novelist, I suppose, which aren't things that I'd thought about before. So yeah, it is good.